The UN Sustainable Development Summit 2015, held in September at the UN headquarters in New York, was where the historic new Sustainable Development Goals were unanimously adopted. Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, is a newly adopted development agenda, which will replace the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, when they expire at the end of this year. SDGs come into effect from January 2016 and will expire in 2030. President Park Geun-hye gave support to SDGs by emphasizing the need to tackle climate change and promote equality in education and gender in her keynote speech to the 70th UN General Assembly.
개발 정상회의에서 채택된 2030 지속가능 개발 의제는 누구도 소외되지 않는 보다 나은 세상을 만들어가는 역사적 이정표가 될 것입니다. 이 개발 의제 이행의 핵심 역할을 담당할 UN 경제사회 이사회의 의장국으로서 한국은 개발 목표 달성을 위해 적극 기여할 것입니다.
The SDGs consist of 17 goals and 169 targets to promote sustainable worldwide development over the next 15 years. The goals include eradicating poverty and hunger, preserving natural resources and biological diversity, and resolving inequality among countries. The SDGs also have significant meaning for Korea. Korea, having built a successful market economy and democracy within half a century right after the Korean War, is expected to play a key role in implementing the SDGs, utilizing its experience from the Saemaul Undong and advanced technologies. Upfront discusses the significance of the SDGs and the role of Korea in implementing the goals.
Hello and welcome to Upfront. I'm Song Sang-hyun. On our recent episode, Upfront discussed the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which was adopted at the 70th UN General Assembly. And how to actually implement the SDGs in the next 15 years has now become one of the critical issues for the international community. Korea has also announced its plan to support the SDGs in various areas, including education and Saemaul movement. There's only about a month left until the new year when the SDGs will come into effect. And on today's Upfront, we discuss the significance of the goals and the expected role of Korea in promoting those strategies. To help us navigate through this important topic, we're joined by two great panel members today. First, we're joined by Song Sang-hyun, President of Korea National Committee for UNICEF, and also Young Soo-gil. He is the Korean director, actually the founding director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Korea. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now let's start with the Korea situation. One of the things that distinguishes Korea is that Korea was on the receiving end of the foreign aid until about actually, we graduated from that status in 1999, and we turned around and became the donor country, formally starting joining the DAC in 2009. Now, I mean, we've all lived through the parts of it, but I guess you would have special feelings about how Korea has progressed.
Indeed. I myself was once a child suffering from hardship during the Korean War in the 1950s. And that is why I feel obliged to support those children who have lost their home and families and opportunities for education, which ensures a better future. Mm-hmm. I once had a chance to witness refugee children receiving food and educational supplies in a dark straw shelter in Busan. Those children reminded me of my own childhood. It was truly an overwhelming and touching moment that I could hardly describe. For the last 60 years, I have always thanked UNICEF for providing food when we were starving and providing school supplies during my childhood. If it wasn't for UNICEF, I could not have been able to continue my studies throughout the war, at the time of the war, and be where I am now.
Now, Dr. Yang, this foreign aid actually that we received, I think that has a significant impact on Korea. Do you agree with that assessment, and do you think that it will be continue to be important for development of other countries?
In the context of Korea's development history, actually, foreign aid did not play that much of a role, although it did play a critical role during the post-Korean War period of up to the early 1960s, when there was Korea was dependent on the aid from the United States for post-war recovery efforts in order to finance the chronic governmental budget deficits and to secure consumer goods, including food, for the benefit of the starving population. But when we launched the modern development efforts in earnest in the early 1960s, that was under the visionary leadership of the then President Park Chung-hee, and actually that effort was made necessary by the dwindling of the foreign aid, including from the United States, toward the end of the 1950s. So beginning in the 60s and thereafter, of course, we continued to benefit from inflow of foreign aid, but in terms of the ODA, that did not amount to much. Like during the period of 60s to the 1995, that only amounted to something like 1.4% of GDP. By far the lowest among comparable developing countries. But we relied more on the economic reforms in order to make the economy hospitable to foreign capital and technologies. So in that way, we made a very good use of foreign capital inflow in which ODA was not that critical. But in number of strategic areas, such as the education and so on, I think ODA, especially in the early developmental years, played a very critical role. But this is not to deny that ODA will have to play a very critical role in helping the developing countries from now on looking forward, because that sort of capital helps to catalyze many kinds of developmental efforts. So foreign aid is not sufficient, but it is critical.
That is a very, I think, a very interesting and important point. Probably that is probably why Korea did not really develop dependency issues that other countries suffer from. I think their heart number-wise, I think there was about.
Korean situation was different from the beginning in two respects, in my view. One was that we didn't have any experience of multilateral colonial corporations that had existed before the country itself was born. So no such issue that we have to address in relation to the colonial multilateral corporations which exploited our capitals and resources. And number two, we enacted so-called the Foreign Capital Inducement Act of 1966, which covered, dealt with the foreign direct investment and foreign loans and technology transfer. And this one piece of legislation played a critical role and guiding role for our economic development for many, many years.
I see.
With the due respect, of course, the introduction of the Foreign Capital Inducement Act played a very critical role, but it would not have done so if there had not been undertaken a series of economic reform measures, including the budgetary reform to reduce the deficit financing, in order to reform the exchange market, in order to let the exchange market to function as a market for the supply and demand of foreign exchanges, including a huge devaluation of the Korean currency. We also reformed the tax system in order to make tax collection efficient and effective. And there was this effort to stabilize the macroeconomy in the sense of coping with inflationary pressure, which was rampant at the same time. So it took a whole package of necessary market-oriented economic reforms, again, which served to make the economy hospitable to the inflow of foreign capital. And then there was that Foreign Capital Inducement Act, also the normalization of the relationship with Japan, as part of which there was the inflow of reparation payments by Japan, which also played a strategic role in facilitating investment in Korea.
I see. So there was a critical period where I think the number was about $3 billion that we got from beginning of the country, which was 1948 to about 1960, and the overall the ODA amount that we received throughout it amounts to about $13 billion. If you think about it, that's not an overwhelming amount of the foreign aid that we got. But as you mentioned, the infrastructure building, and especially the market system building that Korea has taken on by itself was augmented by the foreign aid, but the foreign aid was not the driver of the development. Now, given that, do you have, President Song, any criticisms or any suggestion about how our giving to other countries should be structured or a target?
Well, Korea is one of the few countries which have successfully transitioned from a recipient country to a donor country. Among the 34 national committees for UNICEF, I'm talking mainly from the perspectives of the UNICEF as a part of the UN system. Korean committee ranked the fourth largest donor in terms of private sector fundraising. It only took 20 years for the Korean Committee for UNICEF to accomplish this astonishing achievement after it was transformed itself from a recipient to a donor country in 1994. Thanks to the 370,000 individual pledge donors of Korean Committee for UNICEF, this achievement was possible. The contribution from the public sector in Korea comprises 30 to 40% of its contributions, while it is the other way around in other countries. Much more contribution comes from the public sector rather than the private.
I see.
As an OECD Development Assistance Committee country, Korea needs to sustain increase in its ODA volume.
President Song, you've heard President Park's speech about how Korea could help out developing countries, especially her proposal went to first the developing countries girls, better life for girls. Do you think that the Korea's proposal and initiative helps what UNICEF is trying to achieve?
I think so. As I said, UNICEF receives no funding at all from the UN budget. It relies entirely on the voluntary donations from government, corporate partners, and individual donors to fund its work to protect the children in danger, transforming their lives and building a safer world for tomorrow's children. UNICEF's 2014 to 2017 strategic plan focuses on the 7 outcomes: health, HIV and AIDS, and water, sanitation and hygiene, education, nutrition, child protection, and social inclusion in order to make a world fit for these children. In order for UNICEF to save and improve the lives of 62 million children this year, a total of $3.1 billion is required for its humanitarian assistance programs. But overall, I think the idea proposed by the Madam President will be by and large helpful.
You mentioned the SDGs, so this is a good time to move on to the next topic. We've discussed Korea's role as a middle power to help out the developing countries. We can turn our attention to the SDGs that has come up in the UN's General Assembly. So let's focus on the MDGs, which precedes the SDGs, and let's take a look at the report on the achievement of MDGs.
Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, were a development agenda adopted by the UN in 2000, aimed at halve extreme poverty and hunger by the end of 2015. According to the final report of the MDGs, which has been ongoing over the past 16 years to support the growth of developing countries, people living on less than $1.25 a day fell from 47% in 1990 to 14%. And the rate of enrollment in primary education reached 91% from 83% in 2000. However, still remains a gap between men and women in employment and political participation. And the world is still struggling with diseases caused by the lack of clean water and sanitary facilities. Now, the world is coming together to implement the SDGs, which focus on reducing all social disparities, not only in developing nations, but the advanced as well.
President Song, SDGs, of course, builds upon the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, which started at the year 2000. How do you assess the achievement of MDGs? Has it kind of addressed the issues he wanted to address?
Well, I'm not a specialist on that particular issue, but I'll say this. For nearly 15 years, the Millennium Development Goals have been a kind of guiding force on many issues affecting the lives of children, young people, and their families. Much progress has been made in reducing preventable child death, getting more children into schools, including both boys and girls, reducing extreme poverty, and ensuring more people's access to safer water and nutritious food. The number of children's death from mostly preventable causes before they turn 5 now stands at 5.9 million a year, which is a 53% drop since 1990. At 3.9% global annual rate of reduction of under 5 mortality between year 2000 and 2015 was more than twice as low as what it was in the 1990s.
Now, SDGs, let's move on quickly to what we are dealing with. Now, one difference as I see is that MDG is mostly initiative of the then Secretary General. But now it seems like it's more involved, as to say that it's a more multilateral approach or the multilateral process to develop these goals. Can you comment on the process of arriving?
A couple of words about the MDGs, which is that the MDGs, as you know, focuses on eradication of poverty, the provision of universal primary school educations, reduction of maternal mortality, infant mortality, and so on. There were 8 of them. And according to the latest assessment by the UNDP, all the figures covering those 8 goals, all in terms of achievement, have been, the problem statistics, I should say, have been more or less halved over the 15 years period since 2000. In other words, on the whole, MDGs have been a great success, except that the progress has been uneven. Much of the reduction in those poverty-related indicators has to do with the spectacular growth of the Chinese economy, and also that of India. And so there are many gaps that remain in sub-Saharan African countries and some of the South Asian countries. The gender inequality persists, and big gaps exist between the poorest and the richest households, and between rural and urban areas. Climate change and environmental degradation continues largely unabated much. And then we hear continuing stories, news reports about conflicts, which tend to undermine whatever development success that has been achieved thus far. So we have still a long way to go. So that, and we can capture all those problems under the term of eradication of poverty, because all this has to do with poverty. And that forms the core of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Agenda, 2030 agenda. But we want to go much further than that. Apart from the problem of extreme poverty in many developing countries, all the countries around the world, including United States, Korea, European countries, Japan, and so on, face, on the one hand, problems of rising social inequalities. Actually, this problem is much more serious in such countries as the United States than in many other countries. And then we have this continuing environmental degradation, especially the continuing emission of greenhouse gases, which is identified as the most pressing threat to the continuing sustainability of this human civilization, including basically all those countries. So SDGs are, or the Sustainable Development Agenda, is a very comprehensive global agenda requiring all countries, including rich countries, and that includes Korea, let me emphasize, to do their homework in terms of reforming their economic systems, social systems, and the environmental protection systems. So this is a universal agenda, and the purpose is said to be nothing less than to make a transition to sustainable development, to a people-centered, planet-sensitive development paradigm. So this is a revolutionary agenda.
As Dr. Yang mentioned, these SDGs go much beyond the economic aspect of it, and probably the sustainability kind of captures that concept Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stressed it, and President Park has also stressed a lot about the sustainable development goals. Now, President Song, why is sustainability so much important for the global economy, global sector, and also if you can mention something about Korean situation as well?
Well, I think this SDG is a very ambitious one, but we have no choice but to go forward with this newly adopted Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, last month the world leaders committed to 17 global goals to achieve 3 extraordinary things in the next 15 years. The 17 goals are fleshed out with 169 targets for action that aim to tackle poverty, climate change, and inequality for people in all countries. Each of these target for action is very, very difficult to attain. You see, in my view, while the Millennium Development Goals are mainly about the raising development indicators in developing countries, the Sustainable Development Goals will be universal, as Dr. Young rightly pointed out. This means that all countries will be responsible for achieving them and measuring their progress. Of course, every country has its own agenda to achieve these goals by year 2030, and every organizations and institutions, I believe, also have their own agenda to work for in accordance with these Sustainable Development Goals.
Dr. Young,
I
think you have a lot to say about this.
We have to realize that we, human community, including we Koreans, face an existential threat, which, when unaddressed, will in fact bring down the human civilization as we know it before the end of this century. Let's begin with the greenhouse gas emissions and the consequent climate change and the consequent increase in temperature beyond 2 degrees centigrade. When temperatures are allowed to rise for much beyond 2 degrees centigrade, and we are on that course right now, according to the business as usual scenario analyses, then the planetary environmental system breaks down. In the interest of time, I will stop there and then move on to say that when it is of utmost pressing urgency for all nations work together to address this environmental existential threat. But you cannot do that without addressing the poverty problem, which involves more than 800 million people in Africa and so on. And then we have we've been having a series of events such as the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street, and so on. What does it mean? The breakdown of social communities in many countries around the world, including the developed countries. And let's recall what has been happening since the Syrian refugee crisis, which broke out a few months ago. We realized that one social problem in one country affects the whole world because of this globalization. So that this social sustainability is also a global challenge, and which has to be addressed collectively by all the nations around the world. So there is that environmental challenge, which is a global challenge, the social challenge, which is a global challenge, and then there's poverty. The rest of the humans race cannot live happily unless we also address this problem of extreme poverty, which is prevailing in many parts of this world. So these are all global challenges which are all very closely interdependent, related, and the key point in SDGs in terms of 17 is that these are the 17 essential goals which have to be tackled together as one problem. If you address just some of them, then the rest, on the rest, we may not, on the account of which we may not. This global society may not be sustainable in the long run. So we have identified the 17 goals over the last 2 years through a very intensive intergovernmental public consultations, also including thousands of engagement, the discussions with the civil societies around the world and so on. So we now have a SDGs, which is the common denominator, which represents the consensus view of the whole global population, and then at the summit meeting held in New York last September, all countries, including heads of states from more than 160 countries, agreed to this adoption of the SDGs. So this is also a common commitment. And there is a sense of urgency if you read the statement, the outcome document, where the point being that unless we achieve those goals, these are the minimum goals that we have to meet, then we are not on a sustainable path in the long term.
Before we move on to that topic, let's take a look at the video footage on the 70th UN General Assembly, where the SDGs were newly adopted, and President Park made some speeches to support those goals. So let's take a look at that.
The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, were adopted at the UN Sustainable Development Summit held in September 2015. In the keynote speech, President Park stressed that Korea will take a leading role in implementing the new development agenda.
우리는 이러한 소중한 경험을 토대로 2030 지속가능 개발 의제를 국가 발전 전략에 적극 반영해 나가면서 국제사회에 대한 기여도 확대해 갈 것입니다. 첫째로, 한국은 가장 취약한 상황에 처해 있는 개도국 소녀들을 위해 보건교육 ODA 사업인 소녀들의 보다 나은 삶 구상을 내년에 공식 출범시키고 향후 5년간 2억 불을 지원할 계획입니다. 두 번째는 한국의 성공적인 농촌 개발 전략인 새마을 운동을 신농촌 개발 패러다임으로 발전시켜서 개도국의 농촌 개발을 적극 지원할 계획입니다. 개도국들의 현재 상황과 현실에 맞춰서 우리의 새마을 운동 경험과 노하우가 적절하게 공유될 수 있도록 UNDP 및 OECD와 지속적으로 협력해 나갈 것입니다. 한국은 효과적인 개발 재원 활용과 적절한 개발 협력 사업이 얼마나 놀라운 결과를 만들어 내는지를 입증하는 모범 사례입니다.
One of the things that Korea can boast about is our development in the rural area, which was forged by Semaul movement, which is something that Korean government is pushing as a new paradigm for the rural development. Do you think that this is promoting the SDGs effort in an effective way?
Probably to the limited extent. This campaign or movement was quite successful and conducive to our economic and social development at the time when we need them most. It might be still applicable to many developing countries elsewhere. So I see some point in it when Madam President introduced this at the UN General Assembly.
I see. Something that the Sema-undong can cater to is probably Korea, as you mentioned, had a specific set of circumstances they had to work with, and other countries have their different sets of a political situation and cultural and also economic situation. Probably catering to that situation.
I think there's a great potential in this idea of globalizing the Sema-undong campaign, in that first of all, I think the most important element in the Sema-undong campaign is the spiritual campaign of promoting self-help, cooperation, and there's a third element. Let me look at my notes, which is, of course, diligence, self-help, and cooperation, and all those things together sort of inculcate, promote the spirit of, or the can-do spirit that it gives hope, it gives aspirations and motivations for self-help, and based on and the village-based, community-based cooperation with each other. But then there are specific cases in which those Korean villages worked as a whole in order to invest in the construction of the infrastructure, in the modernization of whatever systems they had to run their village, rural development, and it also addressed specific problems such as education and the public health in the community, and so on. So, of course, this Sema-undong worked very well in the political context in which Korean society was developing in those times. But if we very carefully sort of update and adapt to the current conditions prevailing in the developing countries, especially the poor developing countries, I think this Sema-undong can serve as a great catalyst to help them overcome pessimism and to help them sort of energized to work together in the can-do spirit.
I see. The Sema movement represents the Korean government, it's a big initiative. But let's talk about international organization in general, especially UNICEF Korea. UNICEF Korea is pretty unique in that it involved itself very early in the Korean development process. In time for SDGs, the UNICEF, do you think that there is a specific plan to contribute not only in Korea and as a SDG helper in general?
You know, UNICEF also had its own program similar to a Sema movement, in my view. From June 14th to 15th, 2012 in Washington, D.C., UNICEF with government and private partners launched a promise renewed initiative to achieve an ambitious yet achievable goals. That is to say, to end preventable child death at that time. Data from UNICEF's A Promise Renewed 2015 progress report shows that since year 2000, when governments committed to achieving the Millennium Development Goals, the lives of 48 million children under the age of 5 have been saved. This remarkable progress is the result of the sustained action by leaders to make saving children's lives a policy and political priority, to improve and use data about child survival, and to scale up proven interventions. The Sustainable Development Goals challenge countries to significantly increase their efforts to bring the rates of the under 5 mortality down, for example, to 25 deaths or less per 1,000 live births by the year 2030. By picking up the pace, especially in countries that are lagging, the world stands to save the lives of 38 million more children under the age of 5. This is the role we played. I mean, the UNICEF played in accordance with this MDGs in the past 15 years. We are, and at the moment, UNICEF puts say emphasis on the plight of Syrian refugee children. That is one major issue that UNICEF at the moment considers to be a priority. In fact, our own people, the majority of Koreans experienced being refugees during the Korean War. Right. Since Korean people have suffered this tragedy, they are the ones who truly understand the horrifying and tragic situation of refugees. Actually, we all know that Syria was one of the countries that provided assistance to Korea during the Korean War. Now it's a time for ourselves to increase the scale of international aid and show our warm hearts in return for the support we had received half centuries ago.
Right. Dr. One of the things that
there are a long list of UN organizations, including UNICEF, but not limited to UNICEF, and all of them are so excited over the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and they are now very much engaged in strenuous, intensive efforts to operationalize the SDGs.
Right.
So I think it's about time that we Koreans also realize the significance of this agenda and try to make the best of this opportunity to set the house in order.
One of the things I was interested about, you wrote an article about how the SDG kind of fits together. And this goes to the theme of this is a multilateral approach and a stakeholder approach. You stress the importance and the role of the civil society, actually. That was a little bit curious because this SDGs was they agreed on by the member countries of UN, mostly states. But your emphasis seems to be on other players, especially on the civil society.
Actually, Professor Song, it is not my emphasis, but the emphasis in the 2030 Agenda document itself. That's the emphasis being made by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and every other players in this game. And the point is this: that
this is a partnership approach.
Exactly.
So
exactly. Yeah.
I'm talking about whether civil society should take a leadership role or as the states have advanced their
we
strategies.
have these grandiose sounding 17 goals accompanied by 169 targets. Now, the real question, or the difficult question that we now have to confront, is how are we going to implement them? And in order to implement this, the leadership has to come from the governments. National governments are the main responsible party for the implementation of this. But as they do so, they will have to involve all stakeholders in the respective societies. The governments, of course, and across the governments, of course, among all the ministries, between the central and local governments, and the civil societies. And civil societies, one thing nice about civil societies is that they generally do not work for money, but they are very strongly committed, and they would never let go of an issue which they think is important. And so they are sort of the self-propelled, endlessly self-propelled driver of social efforts for improvement and reforms, and they should be deployed and utilized as such. And then there is also the academia, the experts, scientists, the NGO, the business communities. All members have to be involved. Now, one important thing that I have to emphasize about the SDGs is the spirit that no one will be left behind. In the past, we generally focused on the economy, we generally focused on the growth rate of the economy, 7%, 3%, 2%, something like that. But that's not enough. We have to look at who are excluded as beneficiaries of economic growth. So what we do, and it's not just about growth, but in terms of other SDGs, it's not we, but I mean this SDGs strategy proposes to follow up the implementation of targets with very many numbers of indicators of progress, how much progress that we've made on this target since last year, something like that. And when we look at those progress, we would like to disaggregate our data as much as possible so that we get indicators for different sexes, for different age groups, for between different regions, and also we would like to look at special social subgroups like immigrants and those who are not immigrants, those who are handicapped and those who are not handicapped. So we would like to disaggregate them as possible so that we would like to make sure to the extent possible that everyone will benefit by progress that we will be pushing with this SDGs. Now, who can do that? Who can make sure that no one will be left behind? It's the citizens themselves who are stakeholders, who do have interest in particular matters and have grievances. They should come forward and identify the issues and propose solutions. And the role of the government would be to collect all those grievances and issues and suggestions from all segments of the society. In that way, we can make sure that no one will be left behind. So I say that for the success of the SDGs campaign require the bottom-up civil society revolution.
That's a great message. We are almost out of time.
Okay.
I'll give you precious 1 minute for the last word.
2 points. As I said, these goals are very, very ambitious, aiming to end poverty, improve human rights, and achieve environmental sustainability, among other things, by the year 2030. In order to achieve the goals in the next 15 years, strong cooperation between public institutions and private sector is a prerequisite. Moreover, the sustainable development goals will also depend on, as he rightly pointed out, individual citizens and civil society organizations to help build resilient societies and effective institutions. So in conclusion, success will rely heavily on action and collaboration by all actors. And my last point is that I would like to argue that there would be no sustainable development without criminal justice domestically or internationally. You see these in implementing all these goals and targets, you see the bad governance and corruption in the governments and organized crimes, and all these are the real obstacles. So some sort of justice mechanism should address all these problems before any goals and target are implemented.
I see. Spoken as a preeminent jurist. On that note,
what has been just said by President Song is exactly the 16th goal among the 17 SDGs. Peace, justice, and rule of law. Altogether, we refer to them often as good governance. And without good governance, no sustainable development can be made or be sustained. But my last word at this program would be that the implementation is very important, and that depends on how we effectively administer what is called in the UN system the follow-up and review, which has to take place over time. The follow-up review takes place at the national level, that's the main one, but it also has to take place at the global level under the auspices of the high-level political forum of the United Nations. So, but in order to sustain the process, we need two kinds of pressure. One from the top down, from the high-level political forum of the United Nations, and then the bottom-up pressure from the civil society. But the civil society, the government has to encourage them to play this role and even support their activities. And this would be a sort of a golden opportunity for the government, for everyone, every Korean here, to sort of take stock of our problems and challenges and to address them all together in a sustainable way.
Okay, I see. Thank you for your contribution today.
Thank you.
SDGs represent an ambitious global effort for a balanced and socially conscious growth that involves all the stakeholders. It provides an opportunity, certainly, for Korea to contribute to the global challenges as a little power. But engaging in this effort will also help Korea as we strive to strike the very same balance between the growth and social agenda. It certainly gives Korea an incentive to be an active player in implementing sustainable development goals. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.